Griffith University from Australia. Second, we have Professor Deborah Kelleher, President of the European Association of Conservatoires and Director of the Royal Irish Academy of Music. Third one, we have Professor Jeffrey Sharkey, Principal of the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Fourth, Ms. Lin Xiangning, Teaching Assistant from Yong Conservatory of Music, National University of Singapore. And we have Assistant Professor Dr. Anothai Nitibhon, Acting President of the School of Music, Princess Galyani Vadhana Institute of Music. And also we have our friends from Australia in the Zoom. We have Associate Professor Donna Weston, Deputy Director of the Learning and Teaching, Dr. Alexis Kallio, Deputy Director in Research, and Dr. Chris Stover, Senior Lecturer from Music Studies and Research. So please welcome.
Thank you.
Perfectly. Can you hear us?
Yeah, all good. Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, thank you and welcome. And first of all, I wanted to acknowledge Anothai for this theme, which brought the possibility of this conversation with the concept that a lot of what we're working with in a contemporary conservatoire setting does necessarily involve challenges to existing practices with the hope of finding harmony. And I also wanted to acknowledge Suzanne Vanel's presentation before about the potential opportunity in conflict, and that it's not necessarily a negative thing so much as something that is worthy of being taken to advantage. So we'll be working forward from the previous session that's been here today. In Australia, we would begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we'd be gathering, and that, of course, in First Nations stories in Australia, there are many different lands with many different peoples that over time and through history have now come to be connected as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, for example. Here we are in Bangkok, and I'm very aware of the depth of traditions and ancestry and acknowledgements that are part of all communities and societies. You may also know that in Australia late last year, there was a vote to see how seriously this area of inclusion and equity would be taken forward. And that was unfortunately not something that was yet to be accepted by the wider society. So there's a journey which represents itself also in the music community that we recognize even being inclusive is a real challenge. And for some, it will create positions of conflict, even when many people are seeking reconciliation and harmony. So the thought for bringing this topic to us is that music, conflict, and harmony is, of course, as Suzanne pointed out, about us connecting to community, but there is also the communities inside that we need to be raising these questions. The second thing just to share was that we're not here. I think we're all agreed we don't really have the answers. We're looking at common questions, and we just wanted to bring some of those questions to the surface. But I'm also very conscious of the strength and diversity of potential perspectives that are in the room in front of me, and that we want to be able to move quite quickly from some initial presentations into opportunities for conversations around these very big topics. So we have 90 minutes for some very big topics where we're not expecting to find answers so much as to have some time to share. I will introduce each of the panelists in time as they speak, beginning with Deborah Kelleher, who's president of the European Association of Conservatoires and principal or director of the Irish Academy of Music. And beginning with Deborah, partly because I guess in all of the topics we'll be talking about, and through all of these types of topics and conflicts, are issues of power. So if you like, the topics we'll be looking at, the meta issue arguably is about power dynamics and power relations. And Deborah, for all of the other things you've done, the thing that perhaps I was most inspired by was you taking on this challenge now 5 or 6 years ago to really start working through the power dynamics. And so to hear something of your journey and the questions it's raised for you. Does that make sense? Thank you. So over to Deborah.
Thank you very much. And I'm delighted to be here. Before I start and talk about the journey that we've had in the Association of European Conservatoires, I want to say that the first experience I had at this conference was a wonderful presentation by a colleague from Yong that involved the students front and center throughout and invited their comments and the student voice to resonate so clearly from the beginning of this conference is one extraordinary aspect that I think you shouldn't take for granted. And I'm also delighted to see so many students here. And this is exactly what we want. And it is integral, actually, to some power relations issues in higher music education. So I wanted to foreground that. The first slide represents a little bit of context. The Association of European Conservatoires is the umbrella group for over 300 music conservatoires in Europe and also outside Europe. And this institution is a member. So that means that essentially we are in contact with well over 50,000 music professionals in our teaching and our administrative body, and about 500,000 students. So this is an association that has a wide reach and a kind of a significance in terms of the direction of where higher music education is going. In November 2023, the General Assembly, the Senate of this body, voted to adopt a set of recommendations. And these recommendations were how, as a sector, we might encourage safer and more supportive learning and working environments for those who study and work with us. And the message from this time, 2023, goes back 5 years to a time where it became very obvious that we couldn't say we were working and living in safe and supportive environments. So the PRIME project, Power Relations in Higher Music Education, was the learning laboratory for those ideas. And the PRIME project was funded by the European Union. It was an Erasmus project, and it was 10 institutions carefully selected by the AEC to represent different voices. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that and then tell you some reflections from that process. So we've go on to the next slide. 2018, if you're old enough to remember that, was a really groundbreaking kind of year. It was the time of Harvey Weinstein. It was the Me Too movement, where women in the creative industries, particularly film, were speaking out about incredible sexual harassment, bullying, and dark practices. It was also a year where in higher music education, you had conservatoire leaders and teachers who were being imprisoned for sexual offences relating to primarily women. So this uncovered a depth of bad practice and criminal activity that had been kind of hidden for many years. And the AEC were thinking, well, how can we respond to this? And in this very narrow way, we said, okay, there can be a response. But in fact, higher music education has a whole set of problems that actually transcend the Me Too movement. That's only one factor of it. So what are we going to do an adequate response? What I mean by this is what power relations are. And I will talk about the fact that power isn't always a bad thing. But in terms of the negative consequences of power relations in higher music education, it clearly was there for us that there were norms and traditions that disempowered people and excluded people and elevated and protected people where it shouldn't be done. For example, the kinds of things of what is good music. So the canon of music developed really in the 19th century, usually by white predominantly German and Austrian men, that this is great music and every other music should be judged and poorly judged in terms of that canon. Now, that's something that's been, accepted. Women composers, for instance, really underrepresented composers, sadly, not the standard. Those kinds of beliefs and norms were things that remain fixed in our minds in many areas today. So what is good music was a power issue. What behaviors are acceptable to achieve excellence? There's a very interesting book by Anna Bull called Class, Control and Classical Music. And in it, she quotes students that talk about a teacher that says, he really broke me. He bullied me. I had a nervous breakdown. But you know what? It was the making of me. It made me a better musician. So you have this really unacceptable behavior, but this belief that actually they couldn't have improved without this. But then at what point does that behavior go beyond unacceptable? What is acceptable in bullying and indeed harassment for a noble cause that is musical excellence? Because that's the next question. What is artistic excellence? I think Susanna's example of it being quite contextual, complete compared to a conservatoire and a professional orchestra with the music, with the journey, with the background. But excellence is something in music that we say, well, maybe actually it's more fixed than that. And if I say you're not excellent, then is that acceptable? Staff and recruitment decisions, student recruitment decisions. Have you had the same education? Can you play the fastest scale of D major? Did your background lend you to that? Do you know how to walk out into a platform and talk to a panel in a way that they find relatable and acceptable? So these are the kinds of power issues that actually aren't criminal, but are there and are reflected in our daily lives that disempower and exclude. So Prime was about overcoming these. So if we go on to the next slide, or at least examining them. So back in 2018, we said, well, we've got to do something. So the AEC is a very good think tank. So we develop working groups of experts to develop brilliant handbooks and resources for the sector. I mean, a lot of us really use them when developing institutional reviews, when helping our pre-college programs get better. So our initial thing was, okay, what working group are we going to get to work on this? And actually, Bernard LANSKEY, to my left, said, this doesn't feel like something that's a top-down kind of answer. What do we do with bottom-up? So we took this and we said, right, well, what are the models of deliberative democracy that are out there that could actually get everybody talking about the issue, but in a safe and equitable way? And in Ireland, my small country, we've used very successfully the Citizens' Assembly model, where you have 99 random people and one chair that get together and are advised by experts on a topic and then come with recommendations. And those recommendations go to government. And in most cases, such as in the case of marriage equality and abortion, they are adopted via a people's referendum. But it's a way of taking potentially toxic issues, because the issues I mentioned are not easy issues, and ventilating them in a way that feels more equal. So this is what we did in Prime. We got 50 students, administrative staff, and teachers in more or less equal quantities to meet 4 times, twice online, sadly, because of COVID, and twice in person, where we debated 4 issues. What is power? What do power relations mean? What are the issues around gender, all genders, and how can they disempower and how can we overcome them? What are the issues about socioeconomic difficulties and disability, and how can they disempower in higher music education? And what are artistic standards? And what can we understand by what they mean in terms of power relations? This assembly came up with recommendations. They came up with a toolkit for in an institution developing your own workshops and citizens' assemblies. They had expert papers, which always informed the assemblies. You couldn't just come in with top of the head thinking. You had to know what the issues were, what the statistics were. And there is a website on Prime where all of these resources are freely available. We will also have a peer-reviewed publication coming out in November 2024, which I've read and is incredibly interesting. If we go on to the next slide. This is the peer-reviewed publication, and I'm not going to go into details, but I would recommend that you would read it because it's deliberately made to be reader-friendly, that you can dip in and out of according to what's interesting to you. Let's go on to the next slide. One of the most interesting presenters via video was a man called Robert Chambers. And he was the person that, through the video, said, power isn't a bad thing. You don't necessarily are corrupt because you have power, but you have to understand the power you have. It has to inform the kinds of decisions you make and how you go about your lives. And it is also possible to make you a stronger and more confident person in your own skin. So the 5 types of power were power over. This is what a conductor has. This is what a leader of a music conservatory has. We have power over people in that we can make decisions that they will then do things in a simplistic way. Power 2 is a certain amount of agency. You have a power to change the repertoire if you're a student. Power to change the repertoire if you're a teacher. To change the conditions of your working life by negotiation. Power with is more like students' unions, unions themselves, so a collective where you're not on your own with these decisions, that you are part of something bigger. Power within is a personal thing. It's your agency. It's your sense of autonomy, that you are confident in yourself, that you know you can make certain decisions that will enable you to make changes or make whatever changes need to be large or small. And the final one, power to empower, was something that we found very interesting, which is as leaders, as teachers, to help empower our colleagues and our students so that they themselves would have more sense of confidence and ownership and that they could speak up. If we go on to the next slide. We've had this journey, and these recommendations were adopted by the AEC. And Bernard asked me to think, well, what did I learn? What could I do? And these are the 4 things that I came up with, the 4 Ps. And some of them are to do with, well, most of them are to do with me as a conservatoire leader, because these recommendations, there are about 25 of them. They were adopted by the sector, but that could be meaningless. They may go nowhere. So the question is, as a conservatoire leader, I have to go back, and we hope that our leadership will go back and enact these. So what have I learned? The first thing is, I learned as a leader, I have to make it personal. Back in 2018 and again in 2023, I learned something from Rob Cucetta, who I think many of you might know from the University of Southern California, Thornton School of Music. He wanted to change his curriculum. And in order to get his staff on board, he met them all for dinners, staff dinners. Now, I don't have his budget, so I met my staff for a cup of tea and biscuits, and in 2s and 3s. And I discussed, especially in 2018, the Me Too movement and power and bullying and the dynamic between teachers and students. That's where I was. And they were very frank with me on their experiences. And, you know, on the one hand, my most delightful teachers were lovely people, but, you know, well, can I really make my students excellent if they're not slightly scared of me? These were the kinds of questions that these very nice people were asking me, because that's how they learned. So, but my personal investment of time signaled that I was very much behind trying to change the power dynamics in the institution. So that's the first thing I led. It is actually personal, and it has to be signaled in an overt way that leadership is behind this. So in committee meetings, in student meetings, I will refer to Prime a fair bit. The second aspect that came up in the recommendations a lot was policies. One of the things, even though Prime was based in Europe, within Europe, the different institutions were in different places as regards procedures. You know, for instance, in Ireland, in a student's exam, the teacher would never be present. In certain institutions in Austria, in every exam, the teacher is both present and marking. So this is an example, a simple example of a power dynamic. And it's only one example of many that came up. So what I mean by policies are codes of conduct policies, maternity leave policies, carer leave policies, tuition refund policies. These are dry policies, but a policy is like a foundation or a backbone. It's the thing you go to when bad stuff happens. And it's a roadmap for getting through that. So policies matter, developing policies matter. But the second P or the third P is practice. They don't matter at all if they're not used and they're not respected and they're not followed, and that they're not regarded actually as living documents. So in the academy, we have many policies, and sometimes they change, having had an experience where the policy wasn't so good. So we call this a kind of an iterative. It's a learning document. So the practice of what we know is good conduct has to be enacted. So we do try to encourage conversations where those practices are breached. And we try, for instance, this year we're bringing in an outside party, because one of the things our students say is, okay, if a teacher breaches what I think is good conduct, I'm afraid to tell that because that will affect my career. I'll be known as a problem student. The head of department, I'm not comfortable going to them because they'll label me as a problem. So now we have an external third party who will, in a professional way, just roll that out. So the student, or indeed a teacher or an administrator, can have their lives while this attempts to go in a parallel way, so that you're not bringing a whole community into the stress. There's a professional who's managing it. So the practice of those policies. And the final P, it resonates through everything, not just power relations, but everything in life, persistence. So those recommendations in November 2023, it was a really important moment that the sector could say, yes, we think we need to work better to be more safe and supportive. But if we left it there, then it will falter. This is a systemic problem in higher music education, which needs a systemic answer. So as a conservatoire leader, I will be mentioning power relations and Prime continuously in committees through small training sessions. For instance, our faculty tend not to come to special training sessions on things if it's not mandatory. So now we're introducing 10 minutes, 15-minute blasts of practice in their faculty meetings, which they do attend. So we're using every means to keep the conversation going, and that will have to persist probably over a few years before we start to see meaningful results. So the persistence of that is something I've also learned. I have a feeling I'm at the end of my slides, and I probably have gone on for too long, but that is the journey. And the AEC reflection of persistence is we have training, we have teams that go to conservatoires that have safe spaces in our conferences. So we are working as an institution to live the recommendations that this wonderful group of 50 came together very generously to do over that period of years.
Thank you so much, Deborah. I'm sure there's been lots that people will be thinking about this. I didn't introduce Anothai in terms of her facilitatory relationship for our session today, but it's probably visible to everybody outside what you are doing. Anothai suggested to me that she's effectively functioning as an AI engine for this session, and you will see that there's a conflict between the topics that we're presenting up front and the slides and the bullet points that were in the discussion before. But of course, like many conflicts, there are ways to find connections to reflect differently. So Anothai's AI job at present, as you'll see, is to be summarizing against the 5 original bullet points and to invite you, in fact, also to share questions that might be coming up for you, so that as we move through the session, we can get into a conversation and a dialogue, in fact, in the group. But thank you, Deborah. There's so much in there that we'll unpack later on. One dimension of these power dynamics, which is a very real one for many of us, and you referred to it before in the privilege that some people will have had to be ready to answer the right questions in the right way at audition. But that just turning to Jeff, one of the things I know you've been facing in Scotland has been that issue of comparative privilege or inconsistency, if you like, in the socioeconomic area. So I hope that you might take that forward as an example that you've been working through in the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Bernard. Very happy to be here. Just as a quick example, the actor James McAvoy graduated from us, but when he was a teenager, he was living in a pretty disadvantaged district of Glasgow called Drumchapel, full of these tall high-rises that were built with good intentions to give people indoor bathrooms that they didn't have when they lived in tenements, but ended up being areas of isolation because they weren't connected to stores, to shopping, to neighborhoods, and ended up being areas of a lot of drugs. And James credits coming to acting as keeping him from getting into drugs in a big way. And what got him in the 1990s was a music teacher that said, instead of acting out in my class, why don't you consider studying acting in the juniors department of the RCS? And I'm assuming that teacher might have been an alum of ours, all these things, but all these things happened to line up to rescue James from would have been something you wouldn't have seen him in X-Men, you wouldn't have seen him in Atonement, you wouldn't have known this individual existed. And that was a bit of luck that happened for him. And he's since given back and given scholarships for disadvantaged young people to study acting, because as he says, everything is an act. We all fake it till we make it. And he wants people, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, to know how to hold a room, to know how to hold people's eyes, to know how to present. And he's a passionate campaigner on that aspect. So in Scotland, we have a law that says 20% of our Scottish enrollment must come from the poorest socioeconomic areas of Scotland. And this is across all of higher education. But it's a real challenge for us in the arts, because in every school in Scotland, they still teach mathematics, they still teach English, they still teach history. But not in every school in Scotland do they teach music, do they teach acting, or do they teach dance. And we have set up a number of interventions to try to help this. And it's still, I find it a tremendous challenge. One of the things that we have as an advantage, as a plus on the plus side, is this idea of traditional music. Celtic traditional music is in the bloodstream of every Scot that I know. And it is giving, and it's about sharing. It's the word Kallio is not just a dance. It's about, oh, you have that song and you have that poem. Let's hear it together. So that is a great thing. And it's seen to be a privilege. It's seen to be something that anyone can do. You don't need a degree to have it. So we're building on that. But we set up a program called Transitions, where we work in different parts of the nation, either sending teachers to them or sending eyes and ears to those areas to find students that we need to invite in to our pre-college programs, our juniors programs. We make a cohort of them so they don't feel that they're odd and sticking out. We give everyone a coaching session, and we mentor them through the pre-college into the college. So they have a mentor that lasts with them through the 4 years of undergraduate, and they also get career advice going forward. It takes that level. We have to be responsible for our pipeline. What we have found is it has brought real joy ultimately into the institution, because as Suzanne was saying, too much of classical music is come to us when you're ready. We invite you to our temple when you're ready and understand our ritual. Know not to applaud in between movements. Please don't bring children because they make noise. We did this to ourselves, we classical musicians. And this is totally changing. the environment that we have. One of the things we were talking about yesterday, and I'll raise it now because it's one of my favorite things about my institution in Glasgow, is where we eat lunch. Where we eat lunch is, one of my colleagues was saying, is an example of privilege or difference. People that can afford to buy lunch, people that bring lunch. Traditional old-fashioned universities have a high table for the privileged dons and professoriate. And we just have an open cafe where you can either go to the cafe and buy something, or you can bring a bag lunch, or you can go to Burger King. And in that cafe will be audience members. In that cafe will be teachers. In that cafe will be artists of all disciplines. And one of the things I felt is having, for instance, our production students with paint splattered trousers next to a classical violinist is good for both of them, because there's craft and creativity in what each of them bring. And it keeps, I say this as a classical musician, keeps us from getting too up ourselves, because you have these other art forms. But again, the challenge I have even in the craft disciplines. So we teach production arts, so we have people who build a set. I'm trying to get people that might not have gone to university, that might have become house builders, to think, or carpenters, to come and be a carpenter for a set. I'm trying to get people that might become house painters to learn scenic arts, or if they're in between being a house painter or a fine artist, they don't know their place yet. What about here? If they're good with their hands, what about making props? If they're good with electrics, what about being a lighting designer? So again, reaching people who think higher education or conservatoire education. Our name is a barrier. We're the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland, and the King is our patron. It sounds posh and up itself. It's a French word. I love French, but it can be seen to be a barrier. So this mentoring program is one of the biggest things that I think I found. I'll finish on this note. So I've been a mentor for 7 years at a disadvantaged school in the southern part of Glasgow. I'm on my third mentee. But what I find is, sadly, parents are either not able to be involved, or not particularly interested in to be involved, or not knowledgeable enough to be involved about what is available right there that might even be free. Where can you get an instrument loan? What is a course that you can apply for? What should you think about? What are the goals after school? And so I feel there's an army of us that's called MCR Pathways, professionals from all different walks of life that seek to mentor disadvantaged children. I'm encouraging more of my staff to do it, because it's just putting the idea in someone's head that they could come to the conservatoire, that they could find a way in the art, that they have a voice to be shared. And if what we're ultimately about is sharing stories of our common humanity, then we want all socioeconomic walks of life to be part of that. And we've changed it from calling it socioeconomic inclusion, which is a mouthful, to simply fair access. And that's a mantra that we're living by. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff, very, very much. Part of this session, for those in the room, is hybrid into Brisbane and Australia, and 3 of our presenters today are in a shared room there. So we'll turn now for a presentation, or a brief discussion from Alexis Kallio, who's the Deputy Director for Research in Queensland Conservatorium, Griffith University. Now, Alexis's work is also embracing 2 areas actually that I think are a further challenge in the last decade or 2 for conservatoires, which is, as we link into research, how do we make that meaningful in the conservatoire community? And then the second part of it is these issues we've been speaking a lot about here today about community. How do we get that the connections are real into communities that may feel unable to access our spaces and so on? Alexis, I'll hand over to you, and look forward to taking forward. So clarifying for the audience, we don't need the slides for this presentation. Sorry, for the technicians, we don't need the slides for this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernard. Hopefully you can all hear and see. As part of this symposium, I thought I'd connect with maybe a small part of how Bernard's introduced my work, and quite a recent part. When some of our PhD candidates asked me and some of our other faculty, what can we do with a PhD if it's not academia? and we are the worst people to ask that question to. So it really launched a collective inquiry process in which I also conducted a very small study together with Nicole Kadam from Monash University that I thought I might just tell you a little bit about. And although this study was conducted with doctoral candidates, I think there are similar implications for undergraduate students as well, in thinking what they can do when they grow up. So in many contexts, Australia in particular at the moment, the responses to the COVID-19 pandemic and also the economic hardships facing many of us frame traditional pathways as performers or academics as all but impossible. And I think that it would be unethical for our institutions to prepare students for working lives that simply don't exist, if they ever did. Furthermore, construing education as a means to give students a winning edge doesn't really acknowledge the current employment conditions they face, in which musicians have been made highly vulnerable, and academics as well. Indeed, such competitive frameworks have been found to be particularly harmful, especially when it comes to mental health and well-being. Understandings of musicians' work is changing. Precarity is recognised as the norm, and musicians are working far beyond the stage in contexts such as hospitals, refugee and asylum seeker services, aged care and prisons. Similar shifts are taking place in music research, as academic jobs are scarce, and governments and funding agencies urge scholars from all disciplines to respond to the wicked problems of the climate crisis, social inequity, political tension, and sociocultural division. So if we can no longer envision a single stable, salaried, lifelong career for our students, if we ever could, and interdisciplinary collaboration and ongoing contextual challenges are to be expected, how should those of us in higher education and research training support our students during their studies to navigate such work-related uncertainty? The study that Nicole and I embarked upon aimed to consider the role and responsibilities that we have as academics and as higher music education institutions. We focused on research degree candidates, as I mentioned before, but I think a lot of it resonates at the undergraduate level. So much of the careers guidance that's currently on offer for students is often about considering alternative pathways. Jobs that already exist, but perhaps not being identified as ideals or opportunities with students who have their sights set on the stage or an academic position. It's about what we think we already know as institutions guiding our naive students, which, as Jeff noted before, feels just a little bit up ourselves. So rather than seeking to identify new directions in which to orient our research participants, we constructed 2 workshops in which they completed career constellation exercises, where they served as their own resources for career guidance. In these exercises, they mapped their different life roles and the values that they associate with these. These life roles included things like musician, often music teacher, researcher, and so on, but also roles such as parent, carer, community member, and so on. The exercises directed participant attention away from being more employable within existing markets, or at least their perceptions of what was required of them, which, spoiler, that was more, towards how work fits as just one part of who they are and what they do, and how these roles relate to their core values, and how these multiple selves and values relate to other individuals, social groups, and institutional systems. This process of mapping a more complex and dynamic process of becoming in relation to multiple existing capacities and inclinations, life roles, commitments, and possibilities was a particularly hopeful one that challenges the conflicts arising from competitive framings of success or the resignation of a work life eked together across multiple conflicting and competing roles to make ends meet. Our participants were able to recognise the creative strengths that were relevant across their roles and contexts, enabling them to envision multiple career pathways and futures, while also acknowledging the lived reality of post-pandemic music and academic work. particularly as our institutions and education systems are welcoming multi-instrumentalism, multi-musicality, and interdisciplinary research orientations. This translates not as a hope to gain more skills, more knowledge, more techniques, and so on, but a way to acknowledge the core values upon which this multiplicity is hinged, and how these values relate to others, other social groups and structures, assuming a somewhat distanced perspective to ask why we want or need more and what it's for. In other words, through a mapping of values and roles in relation, including conflicts, participants could articulate who they were capable of becoming, positioning themselves as a creative force that constructs possible futures within and across their musical, familial, cultural, social, and other selves. In our research, Nicole and I argue that music education institutions have a political and ethical commitment to our students' futures, be they research futures or musical futures, or often both. We cannot deny the challenging and often oppressive work realities that musicians contend with, but neither can we deal with them through wholly negative resistance nor apathy. Simply adding to the list of skills that candidates must possess, enhancing technique, multiplying research outputs, or developing soft skills that respond to industry needs will not help our musicians or researchers deal with precarity. But rather acknowledging that the conditions of work have changed, and no doubt will change again, at times rapidly, institutions might support students to engage in their own processes of constructing positivity in order to bring new social conditions and relations into being, thereby harnessing their existing creative capacities to act ethically and produce social horizons of hope. As such, higher music education and research training might enable graduates to not only survive a precarious world of work, but encourage them to lead change towards more sustainable futures. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexis. There's so much that's obviously rich and potential there for later discussion. One of the things being that a lot of our focus in conservatoires has been at the undergraduate level, potentially rather than at that more advanced student level, often with people who are coming back in from real presence where they know what the truth is as opposed to the myth. And that idea of getting the continuity. So just to acknowledge Alexis's thoughts around how do we build this into undergraduate experience when that can often be conflicting with the more immediate journey there. Turning to Lin Xiangning, I just recognize, of course, I've known you through through the secondary school experiences into the undergraduate experience, and now where you're not only a younger staff member, but also embarking on a PhD. So there's a direct link to the sort of points that Alexis was sharing, and just recognizing too the intersectionality that turns up on our panel, where you're a different generation from those of us who are sort of leading the institutions, and how we might hear your voice in this mix. I also wanted to acknowledge Anothai, because it was actually Anothai originally asked to be as the next speaker, and Anothai suggested Xiangning as somebody to bring into the mix and to hear that voice. And conscious also in Yong Conservatoire last year for the performance present, that the final session was given over to everyone who was allowed to speak in the last section had to be under 40, and to sort of hear that voice of where that might be working forward. So Xiangning is going to be looking at something that was relevant in Susanna's discussion before about the concept of the whole production of the contemporary conservatoire and its relation to classical programming and so on, and some of the conflicts and potentials for harmony you've been experiencing and exploring. And for these, we go back to the next slide. Thanks.
Thank you, Bernard, and good morning to you all. I am Xiangning. So the past few years have been really interesting, and with a time with a lot of change and transitions. I was a student at the YST, the Music Conservatory, and then I sort of pivoted to an alumni briefly, but now I'm a junior faculty. And alongside my personal growth, the conservatory had experienced a lot of growth as well, including one of the areas is how we conceptualize orchestral performances. And personally, even when I was a student, I had complete buy-in and belief in the way that, you know, orchestra experiences were being transformed, because it is not just about, you know, striking visuals for the school's branding. It is not that at all. It is about finding meaningful ways to create new experiences for the community. It is about challenging and rethinking about the ways, the energies that a concert hall can emanate just by, you know, being brave and being courageous, embracing experiments. And so I was really, really happy that one of my roles as the junior faculty is to oversee creative curations in the Orchestra Institute. But of course, that comes with complexities, not just because like interpersonal complexities, but just because of I think one of the main things that I'm realizing is that oftentimes dreams, ambitions come a lot faster than what the infrastructure can cope with. And I don't think what I'm going to say it's about, you know, conflicting like, oh, people are not on my side, oh, there's clash like between personalities. I don't think it is as much of that as just how are our systems able to cope with the change that comes from ground up. And one of the challenges too is that there is no set model. For example, this image that you're seeing here, or we can move to the next slide as well. Yeah, you can see the orchestra still takes the main stage, but around it, right? For different productions, I've invited dancers, I've invited emerging artists, installation artists from Singapore to come into the space to see what they think is possible, knowing the repertoire, speaking with the students. And this is the latest production. We've had like 5 gigantic screens above the orchestra, but it is very low budget because, you know, there is still the reality of budget, but big dreams, little budget. What can we do with that? So these screens are very, very DIY, and it came together on the day of the show. But, you know, but also, you know, the trust, how full speed productions go at, like Deborah was saying, there's no time to ventilate issues. There's no time for that. It is all about what can we make happen in the shortest time possible. And one of my struggles is perhaps it has something to do with my position as a junior faculty. Perhaps it has to do with, you know, the Orchestra Institute still valuing the orchestra performance above. You know, it is still the most important component of the experience. And perhaps it is also about, I don't think anybody seeks conflicts, right? But conflicts is a byproduct. It happens because of just people having different priorities and different dreams. Nobody seeks conflicts, I think. And so in a production, everybody has different roles and different, you know, things that they think they ought to bring to the table. And so it is a necessary tension field. But because of that, I have faced a lot of no's as well. Can we hang the screens? No. Is it safe to do that? Probably no. Can we have more time, you know, for the dancers to work with the students? No. And at first, I was very daunted by the no's. And I was beginning to think, how imaginary is this battle that I sense that I'm facing, right? But also, I think what Deborah said just now gave me some answers to explain what I had been facing, because I don't think I'm completely powerless. I may not have power over, but like what you said, the power to, the power within, and the power to empower, right? I believe I do have those. I have the power to convince, to persuade, to engage, you know, in a more fruitful discussion beyond the no's. Why not? And what can I do, right, to make your job easier? And perhaps how can I inspire you to think about, whoa, you know, these are new ways of considering my position and what I can contribute to the production. The power within, right, to still hold strong to the belief that the concept that we bring into every production. And of course, most importantly, the power to empower. Because I can still freshly, vividly remember the days where I was a student And through people like Jeff, whom I met during my exchange at the RCS, Bernard, and of course, Prof. Ho at the back, who said a lot of yeses, like plenty of yeses to me, right? Who gave me plenty of agency to pursue ideas. And that is the torch that I want to pass forward to the students whom I engage in every project, right? What do you want to bring to the table? Tell me your wildest dreams and I will try to make it happen, even if it means, you know, staying up to plaster the screens. I will make it happen. And I think just tuning into that helps. So maybe what I want to bring to this discussion is, because I recognize that at PGVIM as well, there are many who, similar to what I've gone through, you know, freshly emerged, like students, just alumni, and then, you know, transitioning into faculty, coming back to the school with fresh identities. There are many complexities involved in that, but also what Suzanne was saying just now, you know, in experience economy, how can we think about productions as music conservatories? Thank you.
Thank you, Xiangning. So many thoughts in there. Of course, this idea of transitioning identities, which are obviously part of environments, and that particular issue of people risking being labeled as the identity when they were first known, or in sometimes self-labeling that this is my expertise, this is my field for taking forward. And the same thing in PGVIM as it was in YST, and sometimes, well, I've experienced it in other places myself, where you're known as the original junior faculty who now may have a leadership position, but you're still that person in the relationships and so on. So there are many other dimensions beyond the production, which you touched on so eloquently there. Thank you. Thanks, Xiangning. Moving across back to Australia, Christova came to Australia during COVID from Norway, but originally from the United States, with a dream, which he's been working on now for quite a while, which is to work out how do we get inside, how do we open up equal opportunity, equal access for all musics, genres, peoples, in that very deep theoretical setting of what is music, what is inside music, and how might we reappraise those systems that we have inherited as we talk about these, leading back to some of the points that Deborah made before of the higher arts and the other arts and so on. So over to Chris, and just some of the journey you felt, I guess, over the last 3 or 4 years, and how it links into your identity and beliefs. Chris.
Thanks, Bernard, and hi, everybody. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about, following exactly on that, about a particular curriculum redesign I've been leading, which is the first year music theory and oral studies core. We're now in our 3rd year of the new model, which remains in a state of perpetual development and tweaking, in part in response to student needs, in part in dialogue with cohort-specific contingencies, and in part as we continue to nuance our own teaching and learning best practices. For today, I'm boiling the lay of the land down to 5 ongoing contexts in which all this work situates. First is an understanding of the limited scope of traditional tertiary music theory teaching and learning, with its Western Euroclassical purview, its emphasis on score-based study and concomitant privileging of visual experiences of music, and its valorization of particular kinds of music literacies and dismissal of others. The second context is historical understandings of what music theory is for and what its scope and method ought to be. By this I mean that limited scope I just described is largely understood and accepted by students and many teachers, with at least 2 challenging implications. First, a fundamental distrust of methods and frameworks that stretch beyond conventional understandings, as if by doing so, students are denied access to the arcana of past practices. And second, in dialectical contradiction to this, a belief that theory is not especially relevant or important for one's own musical development. Very interestingly, many students and their teachers hold on to both of these contradictory opinions. This connects to the third context, which is that music theory is often experienced as stopping when the class ends, that theory is more or less disconnected from practice. I'd argue there's some truth to this in the context of how music theory has conventionally been taught in Australia and elsewhere. The fourth context is the expansion of the tertiary music teaching experience to encompass pluralities of student interests, skills, and experience levels. There's a clear historical arc as the Conservatory worldwide has gradually opened, first to experimental practices, then to jazz, then popular music and global practices. That's too neat a story, but you get the picture. Music theory needs to account for this expansion. The fifth context is the hyper-neoliberalization and technocratic thrust of the contemporary university with its top-down management structures and all the rest of it. I won't dwell on this today, but would be remiss to let it go unmentioned. From these contexts, I've drawn what today, at least, I'm framing as 7 themes. There may be 8 tomorrow and 10 the next day, I'm not sure, which we might call challenges or conduits or capacities or something like that. These are listening, creativity, multiplicity, relevance, representation, self-determination, and community. I'll very quickly gloss each of these. I position listening right at the center of everything we do in music theory as the foundational site of music analytic engagement. Specifically, I work with the teaching team and students to embody a 3-part framework that we call close, contextual, and creative listening. Close listening means practicing hearing and comprehending musical details with increasing accuracy. Contextual listening means practicing hearing something like expert insiders would, with attention to what music means for practitioners and listeners in its conventional contexts. Creative listening means listening in order to grow an individual's creative practice. The second theme, creativity, refers to a shift in focus away from theory as an explanatory endeavor that points toward better understanding past practices, to an imaginative one pointing toward what else might be possible. This links to a long tradition of speculative theoretical work that points toward new kinds of compositional designs or new improvisational vocabularies. Multiplicity means simply that there is not theory, but only theories in the plural, and that a music theory class needs to be attentive to what has been possible in terms of thinking about and understanding music. By relevance, I mean working to help students understand the ways that music theory can be specifically valuable for their unique musical paths. How can theory grow, deepen, stretch, redirect, or otherwise afford richer engagement with the ways that they, as individuals, are attending to their emergent practices? By representation, I distinctly do not mean DEI or expanding the canon or anything of that sort. Rather, I mean engagement with many kinds of musicking practices in order to continuously grow our collaborative understanding of what music is capable of being and doing. Self-determination is the word I use instead of student agency, which I think reflects the ways in which agency needs to be in dialogue with accountability to oneself, to one's community, to the work, and responsibility in the way that neologism has been put to work by artistic researchers in recent years. And finally, related to this, community means porous overlapping circles of connections, one of which is the community of the music theory classroom itself, but which also very much means coalitions of community networks all the way up to the global level, and thinking about potential ways in which music theory can help form connections and conduits between all manner of musicking collaborators. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. We'll have time to explore many of those things as we move forward, but that's obviously getting into the very detailed explorations that we need to engage with. As you were yourself saying, Chris, there's the close dimension of these issues as well as the sort of broader ones. Finally, and this perhaps takes us one level up above from the close to the more experiential, and that is turning to Donna Weston, who's our Deputy Director of Learning and Teaching. And these have been questions we've been asking ourselves over the last 3 years in a context where we've needed to build transformative curriculum that aligns with the university, but has given us space to rethink what we might do to embrace some of these. again, we're at a point where we've done the curriculum structuring, but it's going to be about cultural transformation, and it's going to be about working through the detail in the coming months and years as a part of the experiment. And that's an opportunity, I think, also to hear equivalent thinking in the room as we interrogate this later. So over to Donna, just for your thoughts.
Thank you, Bernard, and hello, everyone. And nice to see you again, Anothai, even if from several thousand kilometres away, or whatever it is. I'm going to talk through those changes that we made to the Bachelor of Music program, our 3-year program, and talk about some of the rationale for that and hopes for what that will bring about. We have completely revised that Bachelor of Music to the extent it's a completely new program now, set to launch next year at the start of 2025. Those revisions address very long-standing challenges such as limited flexibility, a lack of interdisciplinary collaboration, and restricted opportunities for our students to explore diverse musical experiences and to develop their unique artistic identities. In the past, our music program was very rigid. Our students were required to select a specific major upon enrolment, such as performance, popular music, creative music technology, or composition, and this left very little room for cross-disciplinary explorations. Students were confined to their chosen paths, and that resulted in very minimal interaction between those different specializations. For instance, classical performance, jazz, contemporary music, creative music technology, and composition students rarely collaborated or even shared their learning environments. And even within composition, there were separations between traditional composition, digital composition, and songwriting. So this structure not only limited students' opportunities for creative experimentation and growth, but ultimately offered few opportunities for students to exercise agency and to shape their own artistic identities. In response to those challenges, our newly revised program introduces a more flexible and student-centered approach. The reimagined curriculum is built on a common first year in which all students take the same core courses, fostering a shared foundation of knowledge and experience across diverse musical traditions and specializations. The program's tutorials and lectures are deliberately structured to maximize exposure to a wide range of styles and perspectives beyond those that students may have initially focused on based on their auditions, and some they may not even have dreamed of. These changes also open up pathways for musicians and creators from diverse musical backgrounds who would not traditionally have seen the Conservatorium as welcoming to their musical identities. A key component of that first year curriculum is a new course called Music Making, which has been a hot point of discussion for the past year. While students still concentrate on the specialisation that they auditioned with, the program now offers expanded opportunities and, more importantly, the space, mental, emotional, physical, to pursue multiple areas of interest. So, for example, a student who is both a performer and a composer can explore both of those fields, allowing greater agency and flexibility to develop a well-rounded artistic identity. Collaborative activities specific to each specialisation, such as ensembles or workshops, are still part of that experience. However, students now will take part in 4 modules each trimester that push them to explore new areas that they previously would not have. So, for example, a classical pianist might take a songwriting module, or an introduction to studio recording, or a songwriter might choose to study an introduction to languages. Students don't commence their major pathway now until the second year instead of having to decide that on commencement. And they don't have to declare that decision until the start of their third year. So there's plenty of opportunity to trial multiple pathways moving through. The program also supports double majors, enabling students to pursue more than one specialisation if they choose to. Choose your own adventure. The 4 major pathways are performance, contemporary creative practice, production, entrepreneurship, and community education and leadership. And they're designed to cater to the diverse interests and goals of all of our students. And much of that content didn't exist in the old degree. The performance major sharpens versatile musicianship across all the areas of classical, contemporary, jazz, and further beyond, depending on what kind of student we attract with this new program. Contemporary creative practices emphasises original music creation, composition, digital artistry, and songwriting. The production and entrepreneurship majors focuses on collaborative projects, guiding students through the process of bringing creative ideas to life for public audiences, whether through recordings or live performances or digital media. And also, finally, the community education and leadership major prepares students to lead and teach in community and educational settings, equipping them with the skills needed to make a meaningful social impact. And so especially those last two majors, they were not possibilities in the old program. And hopefully through listening to how I've described them, you will have seen how they've been designed to reflect the diverse possibilities of today's music careers. The program's flexibility allows students to create a custom educational experience, whether that means pursuing a double major or even selecting courses from different majors to create a tailor-made program that aligns with their artistic aspirations. This emphasis on flexibility is a key to fostering student agency and supporting the development of authentic artistic identities. By giving students the freedom to explore various musical interests and to shape their own paths, we empower them to discover their unique creative voices. The adaptable curriculum encourages interdisciplinary learning, blending different genres, techniques, and approaches to provide a holistic and individualized experience, and also prepares students to navigate the ever-changing landscape of the music industry, equipping them with the skills and confidence needed to innovate and express themselves in new ways. Pathways are opened up also to revised fourth-year honours and also master's programs which mirror all of those characteristics. So ultimately, our redesigned, brand new Bachelor of Music program prioritises student agency, giving every individual tools and opportunities to craft an artistic journey that is true to who they are and what they want to express. We believe that shift will lead to more empowered, innovative, and creatively fulfilled graduates ready to make meaningful contributions to the world of music. Thanks for listening.
Thanks very much, Donna. So obviously, a vast empire or empires of potential topics. I think there's two possibilities here. Well, there's three possibilities. There's an infinite number of possibilities, but there's the AI engine who may have some things that have come through their extraordinary imagination with anything that's been coming in from outside. That's one possibility. We turn to the AI. Members of the panel may have a question that will kick off the discussion, and I hope when we get to the discussion we can open it up more widely. Or the individual in the room may feel the power to take the leadership of where we take our conversation from here. So all three of those are available. Does the AI wants to have a say? Good, thank you. Could someone allow the AI a microphone? Thank you.
I've been making some summaries, and I think I see that there are different approaches from our discussions today in response to the questions you're asking. And here, this is my prompt that I'd like to ask from the room also. Like, it seems like there are different approaches. So some of the schools are rediscovering subject practices. I'm not sure if you can actually rediscovering policy or your practices policy, maybe. And the second thing is like Xiangning said, embracing positive work ethics of like kind of like tell me your widest dream, or enable things even in the most impossible scenarios. And Jeff was talking about open up opportunities in different ways. Donna was talking about eliminating barriers. And then very much about Prime's project is engaging people in conversations. And I really like the lunch place that you're eating, also the place that the 99 people, the citizen, that is amazing. And the AI would like to ask the room, so which one sort of like resonate to you the most? If you can go to menti.com and then put in the numbers.
Can we see the code? Is everybody able to access? So it's menti.com.
Or you can QR.
Oh, QR, fantastic. The QR code looks like some sort of VIP fan base at this moment with all the cameras going for it. Cool. That was worthy of a photo opportunity from the front, wasn't it? Thank you, Anothai. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you, AI. It's in there, isn't it, Anothai? Just give people a couple of moments to.
you show us a number first,
Yeah.
but my next questions will be text-based.
Okay. Thank you. Anything top of mind for anyone in the light of both that and the conversations of the last hour, just as an interim while we get people? Please, Jeff.
I think one of the things that our discussion has shown is, I think one of the best things we could do as institutions is get out of the way. If we can just get out of the way of ideas, allow them to happen, allow them to foster, allow them to come from all different places. And it's fear of change that sometimes prevents people from getting out of the way.
That's a great place to go into the concept of fear of change, which is, but as Xiangning said, maybe no one's looking for conflict, but the differences and reactions to change may be one of the things that we're working through. So Deborah, just in your space, for example, we had a conversation last night where you were giving some thought to this at the very local, personalized level. Your first P, for example, that is personal, is a very interesting one to just take forward, wasn't Jeff?
Yeah, I was thinking, I was reflecting on that as I was really scribbling away at my colleagues from Australia who were engaging with things, in particular with music theory and curriculum, moving from rigidity to flexibility to promote understanding of the value of music theory in a conservatoire education, which is a highly contested thing at sometimes in a time-starved environment. And the conversations that I would have with staff and even with the sector, it's hard even to start those conversations sometimes because apathy or quiet resistance is a very effective tool when you're trying to change things. So I was very struck by Susanna's idea that never waste a good conflict instead of never waste a good crisis. I remember in 2018 saying to my staff, I want to aspire to a day where someone knocks on my door and they say, I have a problem. And my heart leaps in joy because I'm so excited about and curious. And actually, I think maybe one of the keys in having conversations, which can be difficult with staff, particularly staff and students who are influenced by staff, is this protectiveness and advocacy for the tradition. So when someone is resisting, it's not that they're a bad person, who I think you mentioned. It's that they're trying to protect something that they genuinely feel will be worse for what I'm trying to do. And it's a genuine feeling about that. So one of the things that we try to do within the AEC and within the institution is to develop curiosity, the open mindset, but simple curiosity about the ideas. And so, for instance, in the academy, we're a small-ish institution, but 20% of our staff are engaged in the AEC or in some kind of foreign exchange, so that they learn something from other colleagues and they come back and they say, hey, maybe music theory isn't, a waste of time because I'm trying to learn a piano piece. Maybe it is actually something else. So they can experience different conversations. And that is, it's a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is the quiet resistance or the overt resistance, because they genuinely believe they're on the side of the angels in a conflict. And then the opportunity is developing a curiosity or embracing ideas in a multiplicity of ways that I think is probably going to be the answer.
Thanks, Deborah. AI is obviously got the numbers, and numbers are all that matter in the 21st century. So over to Anothai.
Interesting to me in a way that, okay, the numbers change a little bit. So you can see the highest numbers is eliminating barriers. This is nice. It means that we are actually, change again. Okay, change again. Anyhow, let's see briefly. I think we're discovering. So a lot of people are actually taking from their own stance in a way. We're discovering the things that are there. So this is a good. It's a kind of like a good sign in a way that we will continue the traditions, but at the same time we're not kind of completely forget about it, but build upon it. The second thing, which is eliminating barriers. I'm very happy about seeing this, which means that we are taking actions in paving way for other peoples as well as ourselves, our next generation as well. And like earlier, a lot of people were talking about, well, embracing positive work ethic. And I think this is good because it's a change you made by yourself. It's a decision that you wanted to bring different energies into the place that you are. And equally, I like the numbers that they're going equally together with open up opportunities, which means that you are giving opportunity to yourself and also you're giving opportunity to other people. But I can completely understand why engage in conversation is always the lowest one, because it's the most difficult thing, especially in navigating differences, navigating conflict. So the AI is asking back among the peers here. Can you share with us like the ideas? What is the approach of engaging in conversation? I'm sure you must have had hundreds or thousands of nights that you dream about how will I talk to my colleagues tomorrow?
Before passing it across, can I just throw one more bit into that, which is one of the greatest challenges I've certainly faced in the Queensland context and elsewhere, is finding the time for people to engage in conversations. So there's both the engaging in the conversations, and it's how do we find the time when, as you just saw then, it's the lowest priority potentially for many in the mix. So I just wanted to add that into Anothai's question. I see Deborah nodding. Okay, raising hand as well online. Oh, Deborah first and then I'll go online.
Very quickly, it's a hugely interesting aspect. The time, investment of time is important because certainly in staff, 80% of our income goes to staff salaries. So that's our most expensive resource. So investing that time. But I read a book by a hostage negotiator, and it was probably the most influential thing in conversations. And it is about listening. And it's about listening on different levels, not listening so you can have your say. It's about incredibly deep listening. And that is, I think, the biggest unlocking thing in great conversations.
Thank you. Is someone online?
I think you're passing to us. The sound was a little off.
Yep.
I wanted to respond to this as well, but in very much the same comment that Deborah just made. That I think in music, because our institutions have for so long fostered competition between people, that we are really ill-equipped to deal with conflict in productive relational ways. You'd think that musicians are really good at listening, but not always. And I think that thinking from music theory and musicology, Dylan Robinson's book, Hungry Listening, speaks really beautifully about a difference between listening for, so listening for things that we can grab onto that are familiar for us, that are already valued by us, that we can find resonance with already, and listening to with that more open, open-minded, open-hearted way of being challenged ourselves. So I think that, you know, these discussions about traditions and values are really critical for conservatoires, especially now, because we don't know the world that our students are going to be going into. We don't know the worlds that they're in at the moment half the time. So to think that we as an institution know what is right and what is good and what is valuable in their education is automatically going to be a co-learning process that requires a different kind of listening from us than the sort of traditional teacher guide role. But very much the same point as Deborah was making.
Thanks, Alexis. Thank you.
Just building on what Alexis was just saying, as far as I'm aware, there's still only 24 hours in the day, and yet we have overloaded our curriculum. And what I hear from staff, and I think I have that in common with my colleagues, is they don't have time. We don't have time. And when, 10 years ago, when we first started our collaboration between our art forms, we were trying to reduce the barriers between actors and dancers and musicians. Everyone did so without giving up anything. And so it just took more time, cost more money, and made people more exhausted. And the ability to give up, what Alexis was saying, that you know, we don't know everything. And I'd like to think of Conservatoire as, you know, a concentrated bit of learning on a lifelong journey of learning. I think we get in trouble when we think we've got to give you everything in those 4 years or those 6 years or in your doctoral degree. What we have to do is give you an enthusiasm and hunger to ask questions and look for solutions yourself and give you the tools to do that rather than spoon feed everything. And if we can get that mindset shared, it's not so much giving up. It's co-learning and inspiring, being more of a Sherpa than a teacher. I do it this way because that's the way I was told.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll go to Elizabeth in a second. I was just going back to this deep listening for a second. One thought that came to me is, who should we be listening to from the power dynamics perspective? There's obviously students, there's a community outside. In some of our places, there'll also be a university set of values and beliefs and so on. So the complexity is, how broad is the, and I love going back to your distributed democracy concept, that's sort of a mix of where people would hear the contrasting voices. Sometimes we will have all experienced that thing of, you listen to a group of people who are in separate spaces sometimes, where all of their voices make sense, but how do we as leaders find a pathway institutionally sensible, which won't be, but in fact, in many cases, will be unloved by the majority, because they'll find more commonality and difference, perhaps, than togetherness, taking that competing position of Alexis's forward. Elizabeth, so just turning to Elizabeth Gutjahr, who's the, I never know what our terms are, you're director or rector, sorry, exactly, of the Mozarteum in Salzburg. So just a question or thought from Elizabeth passing across.
Thank you so much, Bernard. I just want to add this thinking to the education we have in normal schools. There's exactly the same discussion. Should we add more and more knowledge and tools, or should we open up our educational programs or educational standards? You know, every 10 years, the knowledge in the world is nearly double the same than before. So every 10 years you have to take out things and put new things in it. And I think that's one aspect, the amount of basic knowledge we want to give. Also the question of repertoire, what should we know? On the other side, we have a kind of specialism, which is so well developed, like a high track sporting. So you really need a strong training to be the best violinist, to be the best pianist and so on, just to be part of the community of the best of. So this training is the opposite of a wide range of educational aspects and flexibility and so on. There's no flexibility. You just have to take the track and to work to become a specialist. And of course, we are institutions where the specialist wants to be at home also, and we have to respond to this desire. On the other side, we have such a wide possibility or such wide range of aspects which music, community, society, arts can be, should be. So we have a big polarity between specialism, excellence, things like that, experts of one side, and the absolute embracing the world with all our possibilities we have in music and community building and even social aspects, integrating very special talents in something bigger. So I think it's not one way we have to think. It's about how to bridge these polarities and how to keep free to decide inside. So not to overload curriculums, but to open possibilities to make decisions. And this is, I think, also part of the contact we have with the students. They come with certain expectations and we have to respond to it. But on the same side, we have to decide what do we want the art, music to be in future in our societies, which kind of responsibilities we have. And between these two really polarity aspects, we have always to move and to make decisions. Yeah.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So that concept, I think you can hold it in the audience actually, but that concept of polarity, of paradox, of dilemma, what was that? Yeah, is one of the challenges that could be in here. In setting this session up, it was about how do we deal with those polarities. And I've been in a conversation, admittedly now it was pre-COVID, but where certain institutions actually didn't necessarily think quite so much that was our duty to be crossing the polarities. In some spaces, it could have been, we should just concentrate on the excellence. So it'd be interesting in the space, in those polarities, where do we, maybe I'm turning to the AI, but where do we see ourselves? Is it across all of those areas that we need to continue and find new ways? Is it that we should be prioritizing one over another? Where do people sit within that mix? Is a very useful, reflective question probably for all of us. Thank you. Joy, yeah, please.
I have something to add on to that.
I'll pass.
But oh, sorry. Okay, something to add on to that, and a provocation or a question, also relating to a previous point. I think I wonder, on the topic of what we see ourselves as. I don't know if it would be a useful practice or a hypothetical exercise to think about what other industries might see music institutions as a metaphor for. We often, at least, I think my colleagues often turn to best practices in tech industries, are like breaking frontiers in this way and that, or multinational companies are doing this and that. I don't know if music conservatories will ever be of such concern or interest to other industries, but if we are, what might we be a metaphor for, and how do we want to be perceived, from the outside? Maybe it's a way to sort of get us out of any insularity that comes from just battling with ourselves. But the second question is, I think the fear of change is real, but also I wonder if conflict and resistance comes from people just wanting very different changes. For example, when I think about the production team, right? As the creative curator, I want certain changes, but the orchestra manager might have, they are very specific, I want things to change in this way, like orchestras should be managed in this way and not that they don't have, they want changes too, right? But it's just not different. And perhaps for people with the power to, or with people with the power over, how do you have an overview of all these changes and know what to do with them?
It's beautiful, managing the multiplicity of change. Just across to Joy for a second from the University of the Philippines, but Suzanne, you want to come in a second as well. So Joy first, please. Thank you.
So I was writing here, for whom and by whom do we do the music? So I think that question is really paramount. And we have to really admit that we are historicized structures and we're grappling with local issues. For the Philippines, University of the Philippines College of Music was founded by a senator who was a brother of a war hero. So at the onset, the structure of our university was really used politically. And so, but that political institution has changed through the years. And we grapple with that. I think it's similar to the Royal Conservatory, where you have a patron and all of those things. But, and so what is happening in society is affecting our rationale. What are we here for if the realities that we were reflecting on are sort of disappearing? or they're changing, and we cannot change that fast because by virtue of our own tenacity to stick to something that we were traditionally educated in. And so I don't see it as a sort of a ping pong, but sort of a continuum. There are phases where you go to this side because the society is expecting you to be like this. And for the longest time, we've been there. And now, confronted with COVID, post-COVID, AI, we are now grappling with the other side. But even before there was that side, this side was already existing. It's just that we weren't educated enough to see that side. Schools were only a 200-year institution, conservatories included. So before that, there was a whole world. And now we're sort of rediscovering that. So I guess those are just my reflections.
Thank you. That's really beautiful. The depth of stories, the multiplicity of stories that come to where we are now, where we may be going in future. Very beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Joy. Just online, because I can't see on into the Griffith space. Any points, questions before I turn to Susanna?
I might just have a little quotation in relation to Joy's comment just then, which is in a book by William Cheng, published a number of years ago now, called Loving Music Till It Hurts. And in thinking about what we do and who for, he's got quite a provocative, I think, but interesting line in the book, which I'm going to paraphrase badly, no doubt, but it's something like, if you have to choose between music and people, choose people. And I think if you think through the implications of that for a music institution, especially within the broader context of the book, which is Loving Music Till It Hurts, it's a really interesting thought exercise in a way of which people and who's not at the table, who's not in the room. So yeah, I just wanted to share that as a point of reflection.
Thank you very much. You won't know this, Alexis, but we're turning to Susanna Van Els, who is, again, I'm never sure of titles, but is responsible for many things at the Conservatoire National de Lyon in France. Oh, so that was a bad one. In France, but comes obviously from a rich heritage of multiple spaces before then, including in Holland and so on. And her conversation, as the keynote earlier, was about the community rather than the repertoire, or in the relation to the repertoire. So heading across to Suzanne, coming out of that comment from Alexis.
Just wanted to follow up on what Elizabeth proposed to us and what Joy said, and actually also what came from the colleagues overseas, because I always want to unite these poles. And just thinking about excellence, and we might want to replace, at least temporarily, this word for quality. But okay, let's use excellence the way we understand it. Excellence is no question. There needs to be excellence. It's a starting point more than the end term. When we look at the ingredients of excellence as we know it in our field, we can be surprised. When we look at the ingredients that excellence in excellent musicians is built on, there's stories of hard work, there's stories of repertoire, there's stories of deep human experiences. Excellence isn't built on practicing the violin solo in your study room solely. Then there's lots of blind spots that we have in our education when it comes to excellence and the things that we believe are very valuable in instrumental growth, all these things. As I mentioned to Bernard before, in studies, research on juvenile training, the same study where the famous 10,000 hours was discovered multi-instrumentalism as being very beneficial for excellence in the end, and we simply forgot it. we don't like that idea as much as we like the suffering of the 10,000 hours. In sports, they are much more, they are ahead of us. They understand, they rather take in a boy which doesn't have the physical qualities, but doesn't want to train 5 times a week when he's 15 years old. They rather take in the 15-year-old, which is interested, motivated in training 5 times a week. They have given up the Head Start idea of the football teams under 9, under 11, because they know that they need to fish from a very broad pond to find the excellent football player in the end. And there's big money involved there. So their choices are quite wise, actually. And I will never forget that I found, after a couple of years of working with the excellent violin team in The Hague, that also they said that the surprise was the rule. And so there was always this violinist that they took in with a bit of doubt, and that proved them right for their letting him in, but wrong for their doubt. And the story of Jeff, of the incredible actor, is a very great story. And we have blind spots. We tend to see that as an exception. It's not an exception. This is the rule. That all this excellence that we see and we strive for is built on a puzzle, on a I don't know what, a river of different experiences, of which obviously practicing the violin really hard, which I did, is one of the elements. But let's place it in time. Let's not focus on this one thing, but let's provide people with opportunities and then see.
Thank you, Suzanne. You raised actually a really interesting point there as well. We've talked about the diversities of entrance. Also, we've tended, the blind spots have been to prioritize the diversity, the specifics of those who are successes at the other end of the story, and the diversity of pathways into the future that we might be playing with in the current space is clearly a really big possibility in that mix as well. So really beautiful to think of the complexities. Time, on the other hand, is it's often linear, not only, but often. And so just realizing we're over time here, to thank everyone who's been with us. There's a wealth of such diversity of experience in the room here. Thank you to my colleagues back in Brisbane for the involvement here. I wanted to acknowledge Nikki and the technical team over there for making this also possible for us behind the scenes. Thank you, folks, for your work, and to the panelists for giving their time and depth of thought. This conversation, which is 90 minutes on tape, has actually been going on over the last 24 hours and will no doubt continue here for the next 2 or 3 days. It's beautiful to have this community of carers for a practice we are obviously all deeply committed to, both in terms of its relationship to music and to people. Thanks everyone for this session today. Thank you.
Thank you.